Dear Professor, many of the public health campaigns contain messages that cause fear. Do you think fear can determine health-related behavior changes?
I think that the goal is actually not to induce fear, but for people to understand threat. I think when a communication program provides the ability to handle the threat, then it becomes less of fear control and more of dealing with the actual threat. Fear in and of itself has a tendency to make people do maladaptive things. For example, if it's too frightening for them, a lot of times people will avoid messages, or they will go into denial, or in some way they will actually not deal directly with the fear if it's too high. That really puts a lot of the importance in terms of health communication on explaining to people what their vulnerabilities are, but also explaining them the actions that they can take and the methods that are available so that they can cope with that threat and come out in a good way, whether it's health related or whether it's safety related, things like that.
How large is the experience in the United States in this field?
It's actually, it's really grown a lot in the last, I would say the last 15 years or so. Health communication at U.S. universities has really grown in importance. It was something that wasn't really that common when I first got my PhD, which now is a long time ago, but some 25, 30 years ago, there weren't a lot of communication professors that focused on health. And now it's really become a pretty common area. Part of that, I think, is that the medical community themselves are recognizing the importance of communication. Because as they advance in terms of medicines and medical procedures, that's great, but if patients don't adhere to the recommendations and they don't follow, say for example, their drug regimens the way they should take them, or if they don't do certain things that are recommended, then all of the greatest technology in the world won't do them any good. And so more and more I think that the medical community recognizes that communication is really an important part of the process. And also I think that the growth in health communication at universities is closely tied with the now grant money that's available. In the past it was rare that large grants would be given to communication researchers. It was much more common that people in the natural sciences and in the medical sciences would get these grants. But now it's actually much more prevalent that communication researchers have gotten these grants. I personally have been part of 8 national level studies totaling near $12 million in studies, which is a lot of money in communication. I think that we've seen some real advancements in understanding as a result.
In Romania, the parliament just adopted a law that makes vaccination mandatory and stipulates the parents and legal guardians who refuse vaccination will be fined. What are the regulations in the United States in this field?
It's not compulsory in the United States, which has changed because when I was in grade school, we all were vaccinated at school. They just lined us up, we went in, we got our shot. And nobody questioned it because that's just the way it was. Now, I think if the US were to adopt a law like that, we would go through some controversy as well. Personally, I think that it's a good policy because if you think about other types of health issues, people certainly don't condone somebody that goes out drinking and driving and hurts people. That's an act that they're doing that hurts people. In this case, it's the reverse. People that don't vaccinate themselves are leaving themselves vulnerable, but they're also leaving other people vulnerable by themselves not getting vaccinated or their children. And so honestly, I think that provided that along with the mandate that there's very vigorous and thoughtful communication that goes along with it. Not just to say this is what you must do, but to explain why. Because I think the more information people understand that it really is in their best interests, then I think that over time that resistance will drop down. And so it wouldn't surprise me if it is something that will remain controversial for a while. But over time, I do think that people will grow to accept it, and with good communication, I think many people will grow to appreciate it.
Have you an explanation why people don't trust in vaccination now more than, for example, 20, 25 years ago?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. One, ironically, is that I think that in some ways we're a victim of our own success. I was very young, but I'm old enough now to remember that I had a cousin in my family who was a victim of polio. And he was like one of the last generations to actually suffer polio. People since then have not seen it, nor have they seen large measles outbreaks and so forth. Obviously, as Romanians know now, measles has been a real recent problem. And so maybe because they've seen that, it might be less abstract. But I think there's a lot of people, certainly in the United States, that they haven't seen a disease, and so they, I guess, at some point don't believe they're vulnerable to it, or they don't even understand how devastating some of those diseases can be or how deadly they are. And so that's part of the problem. And then I think the other part of the problem, at least in the United States, and perhaps something like that is going on here, is that there have been some fairly prominent people, celebrities, who, for example, Jenny McCarthy, who is a popular culture figure. Her child came down with autism when he was around two and a half years old. And she was convinced, because of the timing of it, that it was the vaccination that caused that problem. It wasn't. And they've done extensive research, and there really is no scientific relationship. But she just wasn't going to believe that. And so there are some people, because autism is on the rise, and so they're looking for answers, and just because of the coincidence of timing with some of these people, they say, oh, it must be this, when in fact it really wasn't. But when famous people start to say things, there's going to be folks that listen to them. And a lot of times too, that those types of people will get more viewership than people that will attend to news or more serious program. And so sometimes the least educated in a population are also the less likely to listen to legitimate news sources. And so as a result, they're getting more information from popular culture figures who are probably very entertaining, probably not very scientific.
What determines people to comply with the advice that health specialists offer?
I think that a lot of it really comes down to trust. And I think that people do like to be part of the process. I know in the United States there has been a change over time in that doctors push the concept of participative medicine, to where the patient is more active in the discussion and so forth. So I think that's something that can be a positive for the process. And again, I think that good communication to show both the benefits and the dangers of not behaving in ways that promote health. If it's communicated well, it's not a magic bullet. It takes a sustained effort over time to continue to do it. But I think that it does pay dividends. And I'll point to one example in the United States, and that's the issue of smoking. Smoking was very, very common 20, 30 years ago. And now the numbers of people that smoke in the United States is much, much lower. A lot of policies have been enacted as well, so that you can't smoke in public places and things like that. But the decline in smoking started even before a lot of these policies, and it was because of good sustained efforts. And so to me, I look at that as an example that as long as both the government and the health establishment stay committed to keeping the message out, that over time it will have a positive effect.
In your opinion, what are the challenges of an expert in health communication?
Again, I think I think that in a lot of ways, certainly in the United States, there has been a resurgence of anti-intellectualism, and that's not something that's new. We've seen that throughout history, but it seems to be particularly taking hold now. We have frankly a president and an administration right now that has been very cynical about not only educational institutions but experts in general, and in fact has been attacking journalism very directly, trying to claim that legitimate news organizations are fake news, things like that. And I think that's a terrible challenge, and one that should be resisted, because ultimately good journalism is absolutely key to a free society. And ultimately, I guess the cliche, but it's one that I agree with, is that sunshine is the best disinfectant. And the more people really know what's going on, the better. Ironically, I think the internet has made things more challenging, because it's made it easier for cranks and bizarre viewpoints to be proliferated. And it also has a self-selection aspect to it, is where, you know, in my childhood, there were only several major news organizations, and newspapers were strong at that point. Since then, a lot of the newspapers went out of business because of the internet. I think that there has kind of a growing distrust of authority in general, which has been pushed very cynically by certain people for their own ends. But ultimately, again, I would say that those who appreciate the truth and those who appreciate the actually determining facts and good journalism, ultimately, I hope will win the day.
But who must be the leader in this case of health journalism? Because companies, for example, can be suspected they are interested to develop the profit.
Right.
Okay, the doctors perhaps in the same situation. So who will be the leader who can be trusted?
Right. Well, I think in part it's going to be a collective effort. I think that individual physicians in the United States still have a lot of trust among society. I think that university experts remain a trusted source, and maybe in some ways more, because there's not as many opportunities for them to take graft or to take payoffs. And so I do think that those kinds of experts with trust need to really stay steady with their communication. But again, I think that's a serious threat. I think it is in the United States as well, because ultimately, you know, a lot of industries where there's a lot of money involved, and pharmaceuticals is certainly one of those, can ultimately have a corrosive effect. And it's interesting when you look at the numbers of people that are lobbying, like in Washington, D.C. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the largest. It's very well financed. They're constantly trying to influence legislation in their direction, and often succeeding. And it's difficult too, because pharmaceuticals are vitally important. They serve a very important function. But I think, like anything else where there's a lot of money involved, there's also a lot of temptation.
Dear Professor, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to meet with you.